My name is Ragnhild Noer. I come from Norway and I am a justice in the Norwegian Supreme Court of Justice. I am going to use this lecture to talk about some aspects of the regulation of greenhouse gases in our country. And specifically, I will present our brand new climate law and two economic regulations that has had an impact on greenhouse gas emissions in Norway. This means that if you are looking for a more narrow environmental law lecture, maybe some of the other lectures are more suitable for you. Environmental problems are of the same kind around the world, and although conditions can vary a lot, and one solution that fits one country not necessarily fits other countries, we can learn from each other and the experience which each country has. And I will start with a presentation of a brand new climate law. As you might know, United Kingdom was a pioneer as regards climate change acts. They adopted the first such law in 2008. This law gives legally binding obligations for emissions reductions by 2050, and it adopted an independent committee of experts that should oversee the implementation of the law. Later, other countries followed, among them Denmark and Finland, which have adopted climate change acts. And this year, in 2018, Sweden and Norway got our laws. They entered into force this year. The contents of the law vary a bit, but the basic structure is very much the same. In Norway, there was on beforehand a discussion how ambitious one should be. The outcome was an act that sets concrete goals for emissions reductions. The target is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in 2030 so that they, this year, are 40% less than emissions were back in 1990. And there is also a target for 2050. The goal, according to the law, is that Norway at that time should be a low-emission society. That entails a reduction of between 80 to 95% of emissions compared to the level of 1990. As you understand, this is ambitious goals, but Norway is not alone in having set such targets. The cut in emissions are to be reached in cooperation with the European Union, and EU is also giving their member states and Norway similar targets. This is important because it means that not all the reductions in emissions need to be taken nationally. Some of the reductions will be in comparison with EU, for example, through the EU quota systems. And this was where there was a disagreement in the parliament before the law was adopted, because some of the parties wanted that the law should state specific targets for emissions reductions which were to be taken nationally. As in other climate acts that are decided, the law requires the government to submit yearly reports to the parliament as to the status of the work of emission reductions. And in addition, every 5th year, the government shall update the emission goals. The update should be based on best scientific knowledge at the moment and be measurable as far as possible. And there is also a principle of progression laid down in the law, stating that the goals should not be less ambitious than before. One aspect of the law is worth noting for lawyers. the Parliament expressly held that the law does not grant private rights. This means that citizens and organizations are not meant to be able to sue the government in courts on the basis of this law if the obligations are not met. The Parliament stated as a reason that it is the democratically elected institutions that should have the initiative in this respect and the responsibility to fulfill the obligation. Does this mean that climate change politics is outside the reach of judicial review in Norway? Well, our country has, as most other countries, a constitutional provision giving the right to a healthy environment and laying down an obligation for the government to take measures to the implementation of these principles. And there are, of course, also ordinary laws requiring the same in different areas of society. There are disagreements as to how far and to what extent these provisions grant judicial review, and I won't say more about it than that. It remains to be seen how the climate change law will function in practice. One thing is what is written on paper, another thing is getting action done. And earlier emission targets has not been met. And I'm not sure people are aware of how much of a change that is needed to reach these targets. On the other hand, the climate law, it's short, it's simple, it's easy to understand. It will, together with the obligations stemming from the Paris Accord and the EU, be important and put a pressure on the government to fulfill the obligation. But climate politics have, of course, been in place also before this law saw the day of light. And I will now go over to two examples of economic regulations in our country, which illustrates the use of carrots, the use of stick, as ways to influence the behavior of emitters of greenhouse gas emissions, of greenhouse gases. And I will start with a stick example. The very first country in the world that introduced a CO2 tax was Finland. That was in 1990. The other Scandinavian countries followed suit, and in 1991, the Norwegian tax on CO2 emissions was adopted, and it has been in place since then. In addition to the CO2 tax, some of the emissions of CO2 are from 2005 also regulated through the EU emissions trading system. This implies that companies and other emitters have to buy quotas in accordance with how much CO2 they produce in those sectors that are covered. The two systems taken together means that today 80% of the emissions of greenhouse gases in Norway are covered with taxes and or regulated through this emission trading system. It is a policy founded on the polluter pay principle. Although the damage is difficult to quantify, a price is set to place the economic burden on those who are responsible. Throughout the years, the taxes have also given the state, of course, valuable funding. According to the Ministry for Oil and Energy in Norway, Norway's taxation rates for fossil energy are today some of the highest in the world. Which means that, of course, this has not only been popular, not among the Norwegian industry, not among Norwegian car drivers, who have, of course, it has given them a disadvantage and extra costs. But it has also led to an industry that has been forced to cut emissions as much as possible. And it has given strong incentives to a great deal of innovation. This means that some of the industry in Norway now is in forefront as regards clean production. And the long period of time which this tax has been in force, and the fact that it covers so much of emissions, means that most sectors of society have had these incentives. An interesting thing seen from a lawyer's perspective is that although this taxation puts a heavy burden on many sectors of society, there has, as far as I know, not been any instances where the taxes have been challenged in court. This must be seen in the light of a tradition in Norway and many other European countries of courts defining their role as not to go into or not to go too far into political questions. It must also be seen on the background, I think, of the fact that the difference in income level in Norway are among the least in the world. A politics which implies that one should buy for the consumption of products which emits CO2 greenhouse gases, is of course not as fair when there is a big difference between rich people and poor people. But in a country where most people belong to the middle class, it is a politic that has been accepted. I mentioned carrot politics and stick politics, and this was definitely the last type. An example of the latter is the Norwegian politics on electrical vehicles. In order to promote the change from fossil fuel cars to cleaner transportation, the government has recently, or the last years, developed a strong carrot policy to get car buyers to opt for vehicles that are electrical. And I should mention here that in Norway, electricity is made by hydropower. This means that it's a renewable energy source, and the use of electricity does not cause CO2 emissions in general. So, what kind of incentives of carrots has the government laid down to make people change from fossil fuel cars to electrical vehicles? Firstly, the electric cars were exempt from most of the tax burden on cars. And as I've indicated before, cars in general are subject to heavy taxation in Norway. Secondly, electrical vehicles were allowed free parking in the cities. And thirdly, and not least, they were allowed to use the lanes for public transportations which goes along the big roads leading into the cities. This last thing means that they don't need to get stuck in the endless queue of cars going into the city center morning and afternoon. In addition, charging stations have been built in the cities and also around the countries. So what has the effect been? Well, it has been a very significant effect. now there are electrical cars everywhere in Norway. According to a newspaper I read recently, Norway now, by 2017-18, has more than 10% of the global all-electrical car fleet. And we are not 10% of the population worldwide, we are only about 5 million. And of all the new cars that are being bought in Norway now, about half of them are electrical cars or hybrid cars. The plan for the future, according to the government, is that by 2025, which is 7 years from now, all new private cars and light vans should be zero-emission vehicles, which means electrical cars or hybrid cars. By 2030, the goal is that also all new heavy vans and half of the new lorries should be zero-emission vehicles. This means that by 2030, there will be a more or less emission-free, good distribution in major city areas. Again, it remains to be seen what the result will be, but it is an example of a policy which has had a very clear effect, but of course also of a policy which has been expensive for the government. But still, it has, by giving such strong incentives, managed to make a bit of a cultural change, I would say, making people understand that electrical cars are good alternatives, and which again means that the heavy economic subsidies maybe will not be necessary forever. And I maybe should just also mention here that Norway is in this regard in a special situation because our energy production is mainly from hydropower, so we cannot reach our emission reduction targets by reducing emissions from this part of society. We have to go to reduce emissions from other sectors, not from the energy production. I have now given you a picture of some features of Norwegian climate politics and law. It illustrates some kind of regulations that can function. But of course, as I said initially, countries are different, and what functions in one country does not necessarily function in other countries. Each country must find its own way. But climate change, this is not anymore just a theoretical or hypothetical problem. It's a real problem. And environmental laws and regulations that are efficient and that can work not in 5 years, but work sooner than that, it is very important. I will end my lecture with that. Thank you very much.